Hi, I'm Max Kaiser. Welcome to the Kaiser Report. You know, it was recently revealed that Jamie Dimon rented out Buckingham Palace in order to entertain his close friend, Tony Blair. The dinner took place only days before Jamie Dimon had agreed to give the U.S. Department of Justice a very small cut of his ill-gotten mortgage fraud gains. And oh, how the penniless peasants outside Buckingham Palace gates rejoiced at the impossibly large number of $13 billion Jamie had paid. All hail Jamie Dimon! They cheered! But while the food stamp-needing, bedroom tax-paying, part-time working masses gasped in awe at the large sums of ill-gotten gains falling out of the financial tyrant's pockets, the likes of Jamie Dimon and his close friend, Tony Blair, know that winter is coming, and that when you play a Game of Thrones, you win or you die. Is that true, Stacey Herbert?
Apparently. Now, you know, everybody knows that we have this rising wealth and income gap and the inequality gap. The Gini coefficient index around the world is rising. But, you know, many people look at it and think that it's the poor that are going to rise up and that they're going to be angry with how little they have. In fact, over at Bloomberg.com, they're looking at it from another angle. Blame rich, overeducated elites as our society's fray. We have too many disgruntled elite wannabes. And because of that, this is what you're seeing, the social disintegration around the world. There are not enough positions of power with so many elite wannabes.
Yes, of course. Throughout history, this is the case, isn't it? Because there are only a certain number of top elites that can rule, and if that bulge bracket of elites gets too bulgy, gets too fat, gets too much of a goiter, not a goiter.
Gout.
A gout. No, a hernia. It's like an elite hernia. It's like they're popping out of Congress and the Houses of Parliament. And they need to be lanced. They need to be boiled. They need to be excised, excommunicated. There needs to be an exorcism of the elites. But historically, when you have this hernia, this hemorrhoid of elites, like a Tony Blair is the hemorrhoid on the world, he just sits there on the rim of the detritus pouring out of his financial terrorism and picking up a little fee here and there in a busted walnut that's passing through. It turns into a revolution. This is historically what has always happened. Hemorrhoids like Tony Blair on the rim of the detritus of his ill-gotten gains, fostering revolution from the peasants who are tired of eating these digested walnuts. This is what happens.
Well, in fact, the article from Bloomberg.com calls this elite overproduction. It's called. You have too many elite wannabes, too many graduates from law school, too many graduates from Masters of Business Administration. You have too many graduates of medical schools. There are too many elites. And tied with that, historically, during times of revolution or civil war, increasing inequality leads not only to the growth of top fortunes, it also results in greater numbers of wealth holders. The 1% become the 2% or even more. There are many more millionaires, multimillionaires, and billionaires today compared with 30 years ago as a proportion of the population, and hence unrest arises and an absence of cooperation happens as people start fighting for territories. And you saw this in the lead up to the Civil War, for example.
In America.
In America,
yeah. Yeah. Well, I think the point you're making here, which is interesting, one, is that in the wealth and income gap widens, that you'd expect the people being downtrodden to rise up and stage a revolution. But what we find throughout history is that it's the top elites who are not able to get themselves the best spot in Congress or the House of Commons or the Four Seasons in New York City or some hotel or restaurant or spa, that they're the instigators of the revolution. This is what starts the global insurrections, is when some miffed billionaire, like a Larry Ellison, you know, who's a billionaire, if for some reason it was determined that the World Cup, the sailing competition, would not be conducted in the way he'd be happy with, I'm sure he would buy a nuclear weapon and bomb somebody, and World War III wouldn't be started. That's the way it all goes down.
Well, as the article points out there, millionaires and multimillionaires and billionaires tend to be more politically active. You see it in the U.S. with all the Adelson on one side spending huge fortunes on getting policies that he wants. You have Soros on the other side.
Adelson.
Yes, Sheldon Adelson. And then on the other side, you have George Soros seeking his sort of policies. But underneath them, you have, in America, you have 25,000 surplus lawyers graduating every single year from universities. 25,000. Many people who go in for law degrees plan on becoming politicians at some point. So here they graduate with no jobs available and huge debts for the law schools in America. So they're anxious, they're angry, they're bitter. Now, I mentioned the Civil War in America that had a similar situation. Well, let's look back to that time. From 1830 to 1860, the number of New Yorkers and Bostonians with fortunes of at least $100,000, which would make them multimillionaires today, increased fivefold. Many of these new rich or their sons had political ambitions, but the government, especially the presidency, Senate, and Supreme Court, was dominated by the Southern elites. As many Northerners became frustrated and embittered, the Southerners also felt the pressure and became increasingly defensive. So there was an emerging sense of no longer were these elite cooperating, they started competing. They weren't willing to compromise. And you see that now, and it might not just be Southern versus Northern, though it kind of looks like that. It's about industries, perhaps big agricultural industries versus big military-industrial complex. There are too many people trying to get a cut of the pie.
Yeah, I mean, people don't understand this part of American history, that before the Civil War, Washington and the power in America was controlled by the southern states and their vast slave plantations that gave them their wealth, power, and influence. Then you had these upstarts, the Northerners in New England, New York, Boston, and they were frustrated because they couldn't get their way into the elite tables of Congress and the halls of power. And so this is what led to the Civil War more than anything else. So the rallying cry, "Free the Slaves," was a great banner headline that gave the North a great marketing gimmick, but mostly they were interested in pushing the Southern power core that occupied Washington out, and they could move in, and that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, and many other nations and regions around the world, for example, had slavery or similar, like indentured servitude, and they managed to end it without war. But America was unable to because of this. There were too many elite. There was an overproduction of elite, too many elite. Now that takes me to the next headline here. The world's 2,170 billionaires control $33 trillion in net worth, double the U.S. GDP. So not only have the world's richest been the biggest beneficiaries of the monetary and fiscal policies since 2009, with the current 2,170 global billionaires representing a 60% increase since 2009, according to UBS. That sounds like an overproduction of billionaire elites. But their consolidated net worth has more than doubled from $3.1 trillion in 2009 to $6.5 trillion now. At the same time, the net worth of the bottom 90% of the world's not-so-lucky population has declined. As you said at the top, winter is coming, and if you're going to play the Game of Thrones, there's only one throne, possibly 5, possibly 7, but that's it.
Game of Thrones? What about those White Walkers?
Exactly.
Those guys are scary.
Those are the zombie banks and the zombie banksters and the zombie people eating mud pies who don't mind eating a nice chubby little billionaire.
Well, let's give a good example of this. A concrete example would be the billionaires that rise up in Los Angeles through the movie industry, which is subsidized through a copyright cartel, and the influence and power in Washington to keep copyright extended every 20 years, the so-called Mickey Mouse Law. Now, these people want greater influence in Washington. They want greater lawmaking ability in Washington. So they use their lobbying efforts like the MPAA to change the entire industry of America, which would include Larry Ellison, which would Oracle, or include Google, or include AOL, by introducing digital rights management technology, or convincing the NSA that they need to spy on every single American, not only in wherever they are in the world, but Merkel, every leader in the world, the Germany's leader. That comes from the MPAA trying to dominate. As you point out, there's a kerfuffle in the halls of power, and here you have one group that's fueled by billions of dollars from a subsidy from the U.S. government and copyright law, given free money from Ben Bernanke at 0% interest rates, who are causing global consternation. It was working for Edward Snowden. We wouldn't even know any of this was going on.
But importantly, you mentioned, that's a good point to bring up, is Silicon Valley is near San Francisco. And this is a famous area for great universities, well-educated, overproduction of elites. So these ones are, you see over and over news stories emerging about how the locals are angry about the wealth of Silicon Valley and all the tech giants forcing them out. They're the ones that are bitter and angry because now they can't afford rent, whereas obviously Zuckerberg can afford to buy 6 houses, tear them all down just to have space between him and an ordinary person.
Right, and that's a direct relationship with the NSA, as we know. The Facebook is an NSA spy tool, and so is Google and these other outlets, and that is, as you describe it, a shuffle or a power struggle in Washington, where you've got these guys, multi-billionaires, struggling with each other, and as they rock and roll, trying to get there are only a certain number of seats you can have in Washington in Congress. Yeah. They don't expand them. Then the world suffers and they cause a global upheaval.
Well, there is not enough room for 2,170 billionaires. Those will have to be cut at least in half. So that's all we could tolerate. Now, what did solve the problem for the last situation similar to this in America was the Great Depression. It was the Great Compression. The wealthy lost a lot of wealth, and it was compressed down towards where the middle class is. And that brings me to this final chart. It's the S&P 500. The Depression versus today. So the red line is the S&P up to for the Depression, and the blue line is today. As you see, the S&P 500 could still rise from 1800 up to 2000 by the looks of it, and then another big collapse. But we have had nowhere near the collapse that we had back in the Great Depression for the top, just for the bottom.
No, I think that's a good point, that the markets are certainly stretched, and they are stretched because of this incredible money printing that's gone on by the central banks and the financial engineering that has irrigated the economy in such a way as the free money goes into asset price appreciation but completely escapes wages. So nobody's had their wages increase on a real basis for 20 years. For 30 years, wages have been stagnant in the UK, in the US, in the West. But meanwhile, the money goes right into asset prices, and you've got an elite glut. An elite glut. There's a glut of elites.
That's why my final prediction, I say we're going to lose over 1,000 billionaires within the next 2 years. How we lose them, I don't know, but they will no longer be billionaires.
One can only speculate.